Hi, everyone. Welcome to the class. We're going to talk about higher education finance and budgeting, the overview of it. And let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to review the higher education structure and organization, the landscape, the mission and vision that we went over last week. And we're going to cover two new topics, which is identify and understand different funding sources for higher education, including tuition and fees, government grants, philanthropy, fundraising, and other sources of revenue. And lastly, we're going to talk about the elements of higher education budgeting, including revenue, expenses, and reserves. And so I'm excited to talk to you about the structure first. This is a review from last week, and we talked about the governing body, administration, academic side, and faculty. And what does this all mean? Well, we talked about the fact that the governing body usually equates to the board of trustees. And then we also talked about the administration, meaning the president or chancellor, and also vice president or vice chancellors who are acting as the chief executive officers and other chief operating officers of different sectors. And we'll look at the diagram side by side as we have done last week. And the academic side, remember, higher education is organized into colleges and schools, and within each of the colleges and schools, there's departments as well. And then last week we went over the faculty, how it's organized by rank. You have the full professors, associate, assistant, there's adjuncts, clinical professors. You probably heard of tenure versus non-tenured track. So there's various different ways that faculties are organized in higher education. So remember this diagram that you looked at last week. The one on the left gives you the generic organization of what a organization typically would look like, with board of directors on the top with the CEO. They're advising the administration. As you can see, when we look at our university, we have the president and the board of trustee is on the top. And then you can see different VPs that are heading different administrative duties on different sectors of our organization. We also talked about one of the important position in this line of organization is the chief academic officer, otherwise known as the provost. So what should we be looking at? So when we look at the overview of higher education and organization of finance, what we're looking at is people, policies, and regulations. When we look at these components, they determine what kind of finance and also budgeting that we need to plan. Also, we are looking at budget, revenue, and expenses in terms of money, what's coming in and what's going out. And then lastly, we're also talking about financial strategies and planning. It's good that we are keeping track, accounting purposes, what's coming in, what's going out, but we also have to have plan of action. So immediate and long-term strategies as well as planning to ensure that we survive in lean times and unexpected times like the COVID pandemic. Okay, so what are some of the funding sources in higher education organization? Well, there are different types of funding sources in higher education that all of you probably heard of. You may wonder and ponder, I have a rhetorical question here, what might they be? So all of us have gone through our undergrad to be in this graduate program. So tax revenue, tuition, property taxes. Remember, our school sits on a pretty expensive real estate in San Antonio. So think about that. If we rent out spaces at our university, we can get some income coming in. And also, there's also taxes that are associated with being in such a high demanding and also coveted real estate area in a city. There's also research funding coming in from federal, state, and also local agencies. And fundraising is another source of funding that you can get in higher education. So what do they all mean? So let me break that down for you. There's state funding, federal funding. There's also foundation funding that you probably heard of, endowments, as well as bonds. So we actually diversify all our assets and also income streams to ensure that we have enough funding in both for operation as well as reserves to ensure that we are able to function. So what are some of the terminologies in higher education finance? So we're talking about all these different funding sources, and some of you, finance and budgeting is not your forte, or this may be the first time that you have ever heard of budgeting and all these terms. I know that this class, there is no prerequisite. It's an elective that you're taking to understand how you budget and finance in higher education, but also for your own edification in terms of it applies to your personal life as well as the program that you're developing for this class. So what does it all mean? So let's talk about revenue, right, is one terminology. Another one is expenses. So these are terms that are used in budgeting. And let's think about what they mean and what it means to be learning about revenue as well as, okay, so what's coming in terms of revenue? And then we have, what are we spending it on? Expenses, right? Another thing is budget planning, what's going in, what's coming in, right? And going out. And then financial planning, how are we spending, right? And also reserving and also earning interest on the money that we have. So it is really important to understand the expenditure and also the revenue that's coming in to keep us all afloat. Okay, so I know there were some questions about types of institutions, what we qualified for, and why sometimes some institutions get certain types of money and some institutions do not. So we talked about various different types of funding. And what they are as follows. There are different types of funding in terms of institutions. There's public and private. Public, you get government money from the state and federal. And there's also reporting purposes in terms of what types of funding that you get and what you have to report out. Also, the funding is publicly stated and you can find it. Private, on the other hand, if you're not receiving funds from federal or state, there are, like I said, money comes with attachment or strings attached. There's not necessarily a reporting process. There's some required reporting processes that they go through, but it's not necessary in terms of disclosing how much you have gotten as well as what you have to report out. So we talked about types of institutions. If we go back, community and four-year universities, there's also different types of university, research versus teaching universities and online universities. Some of you have mentioned this before. We talked about liberal arts, military, faith-based, research and teaching, historical colleges, online universities, women colleges and specialized universities. There's also for-profit and nonprofit types of universities. So there's a lot of different types of university that is going to dictate the types of funding that you're going to receive. We also talked about location. So depending on the locations, for instance, international, U.S., state, and urban, suburban, and rural, if you are living in an area where there's a lot of organization and institutions that can give donations and also funding, that also dictates how well the institution is doing. Also, they may have these employment programs where they pay for the tuition as well. So they have this win-win symbiotic relationship where students are coming in, employers benefit because the students are learning a new skill set and they become subject matter experts, where they come back to the company. The retention is there because they're constantly being trained for higher skills and also promotion. We talked about this last week in terms of the size of the institutions. Remember, the larger institutions mean that you have large student population, large versus small. So think about this, more students that come into the program, more tuition, so you get more funding altogether. You also have to take into consideration organization charts, meaning how is the organization organized? So is the finance all centrally organized, or each schools handle their own finances and departments? So centralized versus dispersed, there's different types of funding and also finance organization structures that you see in higher education. Administration is going to be key in terms of, are you administration top heavy or is it dispersed throughout the university? So it all depends on what you're looking at. So in order to be very successful in this class, what I would like for you to do is to think about all the terms that are associated with revenue, all the terms that are associated with expenses, for instance. And then we'll talk further in terms of making sure that we're on the same page. So thank you so much for listening. Like I said, this was a short lecture. We had a wonderful lecture class where all of you were able to exchange your 3 peer-reviewed articles associated with your topic, and you were able to compare 2 programs that are similar to the program that you are developing. So make sure next week you are giving me names of 2 students you want to be grouped with, and you're going to make sure that you are answering all the questions that I've asked you for assignment 1 as a preliminary analysis of what you found for next week, as well as being very committed to the program that you have selected. Because like I said, from here on, you cannot change the program that you want to develop. You want to make sure that you're committed and you don't lose time. And we're going to start budgeting your programs and see how much it costs to create your program, run the program, sustain it, and see what happens. So thank you again, everyone. Have a good evening, and I'll see you in the next class. Bye, everyone.